Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream, and today we've got a real railway profile for you, looking at some of the pioneering diesel multiple units that came into service in the 1930s. We'll be covering the entire history of the Great Western Railway's railcar fleet, from the first prototype introduced to the final withdrawals and their preservation too. If you've got any particular questions regarding the railcars and the models that they have inspired, please do ask them in the chat and I'll be answering the questions throughout the stream. So let's get started. And as ever with a Hatton's Real Railway profile, we've got to go back a little bit further than the start of the story with these railcars, just to see why they were introduced. And towards the end of the 19th century, coming into the 20th century on the British railway network, economy was the real drive. They were looking at making trains cheaper to run, especially on the more rural branch lines that ran out there. A lot of different companies tried a lot of different methods, including the Great Western Railway, but also other companies such as the London North Eastern with their steam rail motor, some very early rail motored vehicles with permanently coupled locos and carriages, as you can see here, all combined into one unit. There was also what's known as auto trains, so a locomotive coupled to a push-pull carriage. But some companies started to look into diesel propulsion, especially with this coming into buses at the time. So you really started to develop the power units in local buses and some of the double-decker buses running through London. And AC, one of the main manufacturers of these buses, really started to think that one of their power units may be very useful in powering a small single unit train as well. So they took the idea, they ran with it. They came to a company called Park Royal, who built bodies for buses and other railway vehicles, and came up with a design for the single rail car as we see here. This was based on a German rail car of the time. They'd been experimenting for a couple of years before the British had, and they came up with a design commonly known as the flying hamburger. But that was put in, and then the design was built from there. However, this wasn't quite as effective on the UK network, and after wind tunnel tests, we see the design which was used on prototype number 1 and seen here on the preserved vehicle number 4, and this is as the cars came into service. So these were one of the first multiple units and one of the first diesel units to be introduced into the UK. And this was back in 1933. This particular unit, number 1, was shown at the International Commercial Transport Exhibition in London in November 1933, and all the records state that it was by far the most popular item of stock there, with other commercial vehicles and road vehicles completely left in the wake by this completely revolutionary new design. In fact, over 35,000 people were said to have been inside the railcar at the exhibition. So the Great Western Railway started to make a huge amount of publicity about this vehicle once it was coming into service, showing it off, as you see here, alongside some of the more traditional stock that was in use on the network at the time. These revolutionary rail cars were already proving immediately popular with just one vehicle already on the line. This was passed for just over 60 miles an hour and fitted with one single 130 horsepower engine, same as what was used in buses at the time. However, the Great Western immediately saw that this was the way that railways were going, heading towards diesel traction and some more of these services. With the huge amount of publicity being put into the operation and the rivalry of some of the railways in the 1930s, the Great Western ordered 3 more of these units to be delivered in 1934. One of which is the one we've just seen, which is number 4, preserved at the National Railway Museum. Now, as you can see, this is fully in the Art Deco streamlining of the time. They really went to town on making these stand out on a 1930s railway, as we saw there against the more traditional steam loco and carriages that most people were used to. These were actually designed for quite a different use than a lot of the rail cars we see on today's railways are. They had a full buffet service, and they were actually designed for business travel. So they operated with the same fares, but you did have to pre-book, and you could travel initially between Birmingham and Cardiff as a business traveller in this dedicated luxury train with a full business service. So they really were there to run alongside the steam locomotives and offer a luxury edge to what they operated on. So even more units were ordered. This time, instead of being supplied by Park Royal, they were supplied by Gloucester Railway and Carriage and Wagon Works, who had built a lot of different vehicles. I believe it was actually some of their first diesel rail cars back in the 1930s, but 3 more were then ordered with a slight design change, and these were introduced in 1935. But the Great Western was really seeing the development of these. The streamlined rail cars were still taking the huge amount of publicity that we saw there, and even more with some extra changes were then delivered in 1936. This takes us up to number 16. There was a big block of them here from number 8 to 16. These were the first vehicles actually fitted with toilets too. So you might not have wanted to be a business traveller for 2 hours who needed the toilet on one of the first units, but these units had now got the toilets fitted. Little slight change of direction here for number 17. This was actually a dedicated parcels unit, of which I have 2 models here in front of me. This was purely for fast parcel traffic running between the larger towns and cities on the Great Western network, and was an experimental vehicle, as was number 18. You'll see here on number 4 again that it doesn't really have any buffers or couplings on the front. Whilst it could be hooked up for emergency use, it wasn't really designed to haul anything other than move itself. And number 18 was the first vehicle, an experimental vehicle, that was trial fitted with buffers for hauling small loads such as single vans or luggage vehicles behind it. So this is where it really starts to change now. We had the 1930s with our luxury business travel on the Gloucester built and the Park Royal built units. Swindon decided they wanted things a little bit different for the next batch. They really started to see that as well as business use, as well as luxury train travel, these were really, really cheap to run. Compared to steam locomotives, you didn't have to have as many crew. They were lighter loading on the track. They were immensely cheaper to run when it came to fuel costs. And these could actually be used on a lot of the lightly laid lines and the rural branch lines, which were struggling to stay open. But if you could reduce those costs quite massively, you really have something viable again for them to operate on. So they decided to take the reins a little bit and design their own series of the rail cars based on the expertise that they'd already had. They retained a lot of the interior fittings, but the design itself completely changed. These were known as the Razor Edge units, and did away with a lot of the streamlining, the Art Deco style streamlining, shall I say, from the early 1930s, but they still retain some of that class and style of the pre-war era. So these were a complete change around, and they were ordered in 1938. And this was a huge batch of these guys. They were, compared to the numbers we've had already, there were 14 ordered in one batch in 1938. That's covering numbers 19 to 33, all in one go. And they were delivered by 1941. So we still had our Gloucester units, we still had our Park Royal units, but they were now supplemented by a larger fleet of the later Swindon-bodied units that were coming into service. These were now starting to be used more on the lightly laid branch lines, as we mentioned, and certainly during the war and into World War II, these particular vehicles, plus the original vehicles, were transferred across onto some of these lighter duties. But that's not where the story ends. We've got even more railcars to cover yet, although only a small amount. A second parcels car was created, number 34, using the later body. And you'll see here one of the models that we have available of that. This was on the Razor Edge body style, but introduced again as a second high-speed parcels car, mainly as a trial unit, but also brought into service in the late 1930s. And last but not least, we arrive at the first multiple units, the first dual-bogeyed, dual-bodied units, with 35 to 38 being built as twin-ended units. So you had one front and then a corridor connection and the rear vehicles. So really being the predecessors of today's DMUs, such as the Sprinters and the Pacers and a lot more modern units besides. These were actually fitted with steam heating boilers too. And they were also able to be added with an extra coach in the middle, such as a collet coach. So you could extend them into 3-car units if you wished. So this really was the genesis of the multiple unit on British Railways. As you'll see, the inside controls were a lot different to some of those on more modern trains you'll be familiar with. They really are quite archaic looking, really, but they certainly did do the job. And that just shows you how much these designs were different and developed over time. So by this point, they're coming into British Rail ownership now. The chocolate and cream livery is fading away, heading into the familiar crimson and cream livery carried by coaching stock of the time. As there wasn't really many multiple units out there, they weren't quite sure how to paint these, really. So the coaching stock livery was adopted, and we see here this particular unit, I believe, at Worcester. Not in the greatest condition, unfortunately, but still out there and still working. But this is then when the diesel multiple unit and the diesel railcar revolution really started to take hold on British Railways. From the early 1950s, you had a huge amount of units coming into service, from the Derby lightweights to the Metropolitan Camel Class 101. Craven started supplying some. Derby Works even built their own. Thousands and thousands of multiple units started flooding the British railway system. But that did end up in some bad news for these rail cars. Although they were the initial type, they were the one that had led to all this, their actual success led to their downfall too. As these multiple units of newer designs came in, they pushed the GWR rail cars right out of their work. Although they were used on a lot of lines in the former Great Western regions, you've mainly found them in the West Midlands, but they were known to work in South Wales and the London suburbs too. They had started to be pushed out of traffic. And the Gloucester units, the original style units, had all been withdrawn by 1959. And the AEC units, similar as what we see here, were gone by the end of 1962. So once they went, unfortunately, they did go quite quickly. But they had done exactly what they were designed to do. They came in, they revolutionized services, not only for fast luxury travel, but also the lightly laid branch lines, which the successors, shall we say, the multiple units of the 1950s and 1960s, kept so many of those lightly laid branch lines going. They really set the ball rolling for the diesel railcar revolution that completely spread across the British Isles and indeed the world, really, and set the pace for what a railway we have today with so many multiple units out there in traffic. With this important milestone, there are 3 in preservation. We saw number 4 before. This is at the National Railway Museum in York, showing that it is one of the earliest rail cars to work out there and also really earning its place as an important part of railway history. We see here number 22, which again, appropriately, is at the Museum of the Great Western Railway at Didcot, where they have one of the best surviving collections of Great Western Railway rolling stock and locomotives. So again, fitting in there absolutely fine in an ideal GWR setting. And finally, number 22, another of the razor edge vehicles, is in operation or being overhauled, I believe, at the Kent and East Sussex Railway down in the southeast, again showing just how useful these rail cars can be. But let's have a look at the models. There have been various of these, past and present, and still to come too. So, as always, check out that link in the description for every single model we either have available right now or that is available to pre-order for future release. So let's start small. Let's start with you N-Gauge guys. Now, Graham Farish have released a model of the AEC style rail car. So you're covering numbers 19 to 33 with this particular model. It's been around for a few years now, but it's still a nicely detailed model that you can get in various different liveries. If you keep an eye on our pre-owned department, they do come through from time to time. Let's switch over to 00. And whilst I've got a few here in front of me, let's go back to the start of the story. And Lima introduced their model back in the late 1980s, covering again numbers 19 to 33 of the Swindon style body, but also number 34, the Express Parcels car. And this is the only model that's been made of this particular number. So if you do want the number 34 version, do check out the Lima model, which subsequently became the Hornby release, who updated it with a full 8-pin digital ready chassis and a new 5-pole motor in there too, as well as NEM couplings that you see here. Dapol were next along with their railcar, and they introduced a model of the Gloucester built railcars. So we're heading back now. We're looking at numbers 8 to 16 and also number 17, the Parcels railcar that they have produced in 2 guises. This is a fully super detailed model. You've got a 5-pole motor in there, full 21-pin digital capacity, interior lighting, interior detailing. You have the removable covers for the streamlining over the bogies, and they've produced that in a wide variation of different liveries, such as crimson and cream. The Parcels cars are available there too in both the colours that it did carry, and of course many variations of the original Great Western colours for those of you who want to replicate those business travel services. Helgen are coming up next, and these models are all available to pre-order right now. Firstly, starting with a model, super detailed, absolutely cramming the detail in there, a 21st century model of the Swindon Railcars 19 to 33. This is coming out in both 00 and O gauge, so you're getting 2 models for the price of 1 here from Helgen in many different liveries coming through pre-numbered, and the detail on both looks absolutely exquisite. Taking a look here at the final livery carried by the Railcars, the BR green. This particular colour scheme carried in the late 1950s, and whilst this is the O gauge model, Helgen have promised that the level of detail here will be seen on the 00 gauge model too. We're expecting both of those in early to mid 2021, so do keep your eyes on our website for the latest details. We've got all the links in the description as per usual. And last but not least, let's stick with O gauge, because Dapol have upscaled their variation of the railcar, the Gloucester built units 8 to 16, and these have been very recently announced in the O gauge. So these are coming through. Again, Dapol have promised that even more details are going to be fitted on these, with the sliding opening door, the centre door in the middle there. And you can see one thing I quite like there, if you look at the seats, they've actually got the texture on the seats as well. I believe that's printed, but it's still a really nice detail there, showing the tartan style covering on the seats, which really does bring them out. So you're pretty well covered for a model of the railcars, whether you're an N-gauge modeler with the Graham Farish model, right through 00 gauge. You can pick up a budget Lima model, or you can have a really super detailed model from Dapol or Helgen, depending on which body style that you like. And again, in O gauge, you can pick from the 2 major body styles that are coming through. So check out that link in the description. There is a whole lot of information in there. But for me, these deserve so many good models on the market. They are an iconic part of British railway history. This is when time started to turn. Whilst a lot of steam locomotives were still under development and still being built, this really is when diesel traction came in. They've got to be the first mass-produced successful railcar design on any British railway network, and that's inspired trains pretty much down to everything we see on the diesel railway network today. So I'll let you have one look more through those images. I really hope you've enjoyed today's history. It's something that doesn't get covered too much alongside Great Western steam locomotives and their operations, but it's still just as an important part of the Great Western Railway history. So if you've enjoyed today's video, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like the video there too, and of course, like our Facebook page and keep an eye on our website for all the latest model railway news and more videos like this. I'll let you have one last look through those images, but if you have any more questions, please put them in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them after the stream. Otherwise, thanks again for watching and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.